I'm Paula Lazarus. I teach at St. John's University in Queens, New York. I am a professor there in 3 different departments, and the Institute for Core Studies, which focuses mostly on freshman and sophomore required core classes. I'm in the sociology and anthropology department. My background is as an archaeologist. And I also teach in our environmental studies department because my interest in archaeology is in the environment, where people settle, what they do, and so forth. I teach the only GIS classes or classes with GIS in our university. So we don't have a big account. We just have a simple lab account. But of course, with COVID, we were all home, so there was no lab. Then it occurred to me that most of my students also have Macs and not other kinds of PCs. So that became part of our struggle in the beginning. So in the fall semester, I had one of those divided classes where about half my students were at home and half were in the classroom, and they were rotating around, and then people were opting to stay home. So in the end, I essentially had the class change so that we would be not a rotating class, but a class where those who wanted to stay home just stayed home, and people who were in the classroom came in 2 days a week, and we had class. And in order to get them to this was a method, actually a methods and analysis class, for which GIS was only a small component, and all of it was ArcGIS Online. So I knew I wasn't going to have trouble, particularly with the Mac issues. So in that class, our workaround was that everybody had, and we were all masked, I should add, so that people couldn't hear each, and distanced. So we couldn't hear each other very much in the classroom or out of the classroom. So the workaround for that was that everybody was on their computers, and all of our work, since it was rather a lab-oriented class, was done in groups or pairs, where someone in the classroom, each person in the classroom, was paired with 1 or more people who were at home. And that way, as I walked around the classroom and helped people with whatever the assignments were, I could look over someone's shoulder and see who they were collaborating with. They were online, so they could all hear each other well. And me, if I was talking from the front of the classroom for whatever reason. And if students at home were confused, they could ask the person who was their partner to have me come over and talk to them, because it was impossible to look at the students in the classroom, interact with them, look at the chat and the computer screen, which was somewhere else in the front corner of the classroom and nowhere where they were. So that turned out to be, actually, in the end, quite a successful way of working. And whatever kinds of tools we used over the semester, we were able to sort out glitches and have people work in pairs and do work together. And that included having students in the classroom make surveys for the ones at home and vice versa, and then send them out to collect data and come back and see all the pitfalls of, the instructions you need to give somebody to fill out a survey and things similar to that. The bigger challenge was the spring class, which is my intro to GIS class. So this is a class that mostly has environmental studies students, but not entirely. I occasionally get bio students or an anthro student or someone else in there. And I often get the policy environmental science students rather than the BS environmental science students. And the first thing that most of them tell me is, I'm not good with computers. So that's generally our starting point. So because it was impossible to get anybody from our university to help us get a link into the labs, I decided we were going to use Pro, because that way I could have them download to their computers, and as long as they could partition their Macs, we were able to then run the program and get them to do some more robust work. Of course, online is getting more and more robust every day, but it gave me a chance to teach them or work with them in ArcGIS Pro. The other thing that I learned, which was perhaps the most nerve-wracking part of the semester, was the fact that storage counts as credits. And so we started our class and no one was able to do any work because they said that we'd used up all our credits, even though we'd only had 15 students using the program in the fall. And I couldn't figure out how we could possibly have used everything up. And I thought maybe other people in the university, but it turned out, after much talking with colleagues through the GIS world, that the issue was we were being charged for stuff that had been stored for years, but didn't have any idea that that was being counted to our credits. So that led me to dump a whole bunch of stuff. And with the kindness of some of the folks at Esri Central, they credited us enough credits for me to teach the class that semester. So that was the first challenge of the semester. The second challenge was what kind of book to have the students use. And in the end, because everyone was so strapped for equipment and money, we decided to use all online resources. So here's where I'm going to share my screen. And I am going to head, I guess, here. And we started by using some of the general options from for learning basic GIS things from Esri, but we also used this book, which turned out to be a little advanced for them, but also very good, by Joseph Kursky and Jill Clark. So this book allows for a whole series of different kinds of exercises. And we sort of skipped around to the things that seemed most important for me to have them working on at any one time. The one thing we did learn is that these lessons may say you need 4 hours, but my students usually needed 12 hours for the same thing, either because they didn't understand them or because they felt, especially one of my math data science students in that class, he was very irritated that these kinds of intro type lessons used vocabulary that he was unfamiliar with and that was never defined. So we had some quite interesting discussions about that part of thing, and also why he couldn't just jump in and change things and then wouldn't get the kinds of results that he so desired. But it was interesting feedback. Once I felt that the students had gotten up to speed, we got to the heart of our class. And so for me in this class, I really like the students to have a project, an outside project, collaborative project. And I've been working with the New York Botanical Gardens for a number of years, and they give us data sets that they need mapped and analyzed. And these have proved very good because they give the students a sense of working for someone other than their teacher and applying the things that they have learned so far. And then as they need additional data, initial information, then we'd stop and do another lesson, fill them in on that piece, and then move them on. So we, this time, we're working with James Ledmere on a project mapping threatened lichens. And we had a really interesting assignment for them. He came and spoke to us and told them about lichens because a lot of people didn't know a whole lot about them. He provided us with articles for them to read. And then he provided us with these particular species, all of which were in different areas of the country. And then the students were paired in twos and each given two or more of these species. And then they were asked to look for these kinds of things and to create a story map with their analysis. The biggest challenge for intro students anywhere I think aside from the actual mechanics of doing the thing, is in fact to know the difference between having a topic and having analysis of a question, and then figuring out what they see actually means. And I'm sure all of you have come across the same kinds of issues. So I put up here just a couple of examples of how the students chose to deal with these questions. And you'll see as I go through just a couple of these that they had very different ways of addressing what the plants were, where they were, how they wanted to analyze them, and then what they thought those analyses meant. And I'll just give you an example. They use different formats, and my own personal bugaboo here, why the new story map formats are fewer in, give you less options than the old ones. I'm still not quite sure why, but my students really like working with the map journal format, and feels bad to kind of lose it in some ways. So we had precipitation here, soil, sea level rise, fire potential. For this group, here we have a cascade map format. So here they looked for invasive species and whether that was pushing out or crowding out the lichen. That turned out to be a useful way of looking at the data. And of course, by having them write in here, it meant they had to explain just what it was they were trying to prove, or even had to understand how it worked here. And this was actually creative. They were looking for wind speeds and how that was pushing air pollution into their area. So I thought that was a creative way of looking at things. And then they also looked at land cover. And then we had another one of the journal versions here. So you can see each group had quite a different take and a different way of trying to show what they wanted to show. Never quite sure why they chose to do sea level rise by points rather than in another fashion. But this was an interesting thought, to look at hurricane paths through these barrier islands and see whether the affected species were in the line of common storms. So that was kind of a interesting kind of analytical choice here for them. Certainly, I thought not so bad for beginners. And the last group here, and here they were looking at these two features mostly. And again, they chose really different ways of displaying their data. And in the end, the most interesting, I think, or useful thing for them, besides learning some basic skills, and they don't have a follow-up class either, because this is the only class that they get, was that Professor Ledermer then came to their presentations. They presented all of their work to him, and they got feedback from him as to what was more useful or what they could improve, et cetera, in their maps. They were all encouraged to clean that up for their very final projects, although most of them did not. So that's really the basis of what we did. And I think we definitely made a positive out of an otherwise challenging situation. We did the work. by dividing those pairs into breakout rooms so that I would then move from breakout room to breakout room and help them into troubleshoot whatever they were working on. And that seemed like a useful way to work on the final projects. And on the other projects, we did them as a class so that I could give feedback to everybody at the same time when they were stuck or they could hear one another's problems. So that's less than my time, but leaving more time for questions. So I'll open the floor if anybody has thoughts, questions, ideas, ways to make such a thing stronger.
Great, thank you, Paula. I forgot two quick things. One, and is feel free to put questions or comments in the chat if you want to, because that'll be a way that Paula could see, or I could read out, or we could continue the conversation. Since it's one long session all day, I actually think that Zoom is a perfect place. Well, it's not what we had talked about in the past. I think that's a perfect place to do it. The other thing is, depending on what you want, you can have your videos on or off. I think in general, what people will often do is have them off maybe while the presentation is happening, but then on during the discussion session. But that is, of course, completely up to you and what you feel most comfortable with. And I'm going to
start with Seda, which way do you pronounce it? Seda, okay, it's a question. It's a good question. So the students were—
Could you read the question out? Just so
oh, yes, I certainly. Sorry. Thanks for sharing your experience, Paula. This was very useful and informative since you also gave students profile. Other than Mac users, were there any other students in need of technological support? You mentioned that there's not students who are not proficient in computer, so I wonder what their existing system home is. So here's the thing. Students, a lot of these were seniors or juniors. They have been using computers all the time. I don't know where the digital native idea comes from, but my students, I mean, they know how to play computer games, but they don't know how to do work on computers. And so they're always terrified about, you know, they don't slow down. They move their mice around like this all the time. And I have to stop them because I'm getting nauseous. And I tell them, if you hover slowly, you'll see the tags that'll explain what these things are, you know, where to go look for things. But more to the point, in answering your question, some students had days they couldn't get on because they didn't have enough internet, or they didn't have battery on their computers, or because they were being evicted from where they were living and had to move home with their parents. But because they were working in pairs, and we also use Slack, so that if they couldn't get onto Canvas or any of the other programs on campus, that kept them in contact with their pairs. But also the fact that ArcGIS Pro allowed them, if they wanted to work outside of class time, continuing to access the material rather than having the material on the learning platform, where if they had problems with the school or paying their bills, they would be cut off. That was another advantage for us working in that way. But I think the Slack, also having a place for Slack discussions, also helped them. Most of the time, their real computer problems are that they need to slow down and read. And they need to actually do what they're asked to do. And that is what it is.
Yeah, because I mean, the reason that I was thinking about this question, because I had, during teaching pandemic with ArcGIS Pro, was a little bit challenging from my side too, because it's a powerful tool and it needs stronger computers than that you used to need for desktop version. So, and I really wonder what was your experience, and thanks for sharing.
I think they all have computers, laptops, which they use when they're in class. So that mostly helped them. The ones that are trying to do this on their phones or on tablets, it's not really working that well. And they were told that 100 times. But you know, if they don't have access to something else, or their parent or their sibling was using the laptop, then they could follow with their partner and catch up later. And I did put them into groups so that they could say, I mean, like ArcGIS groups online, so that they could save the data that they worked on together and still get back to it. So
It's interesting that you mentioned that, and I see that Becky's hand.
Yeah, I see that too.
This will be very short. It's one of the things that I discovered early on, even years and years ago with GPS workshops. The idea that every single person has to have their own device the entire time sounds great, but it turns out sharing in groups of 2 or 3 made it logistically a lot easier than just dealing with the total amount of equipment. Then they could help each other as long as you made sure that each person got enough experience. But very early on, I'm like, everybody has their own. No, that actually introduces more problems and it doesn't make a better experience. So anyway, sorry, go ahead, Becky.
Sorry, getting my unmuted. Yes, thank you very much. I learned a lot and I got some notes here and some great ideas. Just one comment during COVID, and I was teaching both undergraduate and graduate level courses online, fully online, CUNY, dealing with underserved students in really sometimes dire situations. I gave up trying to do anything with the desktop GIS at the undergraduate level. Everything was online.
Great. You're muted. You're muted, Becky. We can't hear you.
Oh, I thought okay, sorry. I guess you didn't hear anything. I don't know what happened. Again, thank you for everything. And I learned a lot and have some great notes. At CUNY, we are really serving underserved students and some of them living in very, very stressful and dire situations during COVID in particular. For the undergraduate, I gave up trying to do anything on desktop. It was just too difficult without the access to the lab. So everything was online. Even with the graduate students, which I wanted them to use ArcGIS Pro, I lost probably 3 or 4 weeks just getting them up and running with the technological problems. Hopefully this will change now that things are opening up and they'll have access to the lab. My question though, in terms of, I loved what you do with your course and connecting with the story map projects and whatnot. Did you have them in your groups? Were they working with ArcGIS Pro and then uploading their work? Or did you have them work on ArcGIS Online with the data set that they analyzed and then created the story map? I was just kind of curious how you did that. Were they doing their analysis and things in ArcGIS Pro and then they shared it up online?
Yeah. Pro
Okay,
and
great.
then putting that into the story map, but in some cases, if they felt that they were too challenged in figuring out how to bring something from online into Pro and they wanted to, I mean, I didn't tell anyone not to work in Pro. That was perfectly okay. So for me, they had learned also things in Pro. And if they wanted to mix and match, that was fine. I only wanted them to use things that were appropriate to their questions and to be able to tell me why they chose A rather than B.
Great.
Not always,
okay, great.
didn't always get that answer, but that was my goal.
Great. I'm very impressed. They did wonderful work from what I could see. So great. Thank you for your ideas.
Anyone else have questions, thoughts,
Okay.
ways to make it better? Oh, thank you, Katie. She said analysis in Pro helps to reduce AGO credit usage. Did not know that. I really wish there was a list of instructions somewhere that tells you all that kind of stuff. That would be a useful cheat sheet.
Yeah, especially if you're struggling with credits in your organization, definitely make sure that your students are doing things like geocoding on desktop.
They don't do I don't have them do it at all. I can't go there. We have so few credits. It's not even a possibility.
Yeah, exactly. But the analysis in Pro will really help too.
Okay, thank you. Super helpful.
Okay.
We lost nearly a month of school on that whole credit issue.
Paula, you actually could do geocoding with the New York State GIS roads data set in Pro, build your own locator and all of that, and there are no credits involved. And that's a really good up-to-date data set.
Thank you, Carol.